philosophe.
And let's also record. I don't know who is good. Can I start, Christian? Are we good? Good. Very nice to see everyone. Since the first part of this session is live broadcasted, to open a window and invite those who are interested to do the same kind of work that we do, then I'll start from a broader approach. And then slowly get from the general to the specific. This is a very specific teaching. It relies on our understanding. Results in this work of our efforts depend on our understanding, which in itself is very interesting. It means that if two of us are making exactly the same effort, but are doing it for two different reasons, with two different levels of understanding behind it, we will obtain very different results. And so we always have to understand why we do anything. And really what the aim in this work is. We cannot just take cliches, take generic spiritual terms for granted, such as awakening, for example. Many spiritual teachings speak about awakening, but what is awakening? What in us is asleep, and what would change if it awakened? We have to understand that. The same applies for self-development, a very commonly used word. The assumption is that we are underdeveloped and that through certain specific training we can develop. But how? What in us would develop? And how would it look if it were fully developed? These are questions we need to understand. And especially this last one about self-development is where I'd like to begin. And for it, we have to review the structure of the human being, which according to this teaching, and as well as many other ancient teachings, is actually a three-brained being, and even more brains, as we will see in a moment. But there are these three distinct levels or brains that govern all our actions. We have the intellectual brain up above, corresponding more or less to our head. We have the emotional brain, more or less in the area of the chest. And we have the body, the moving instinctive brain, in the area of our lower back and abdomen. These are different brains, and all our actions, our thoughts, our impulses, the effort you are making to try and make sense of what I'm saying, the hands I'm using to amplify my meaning, the scratches, the here and there, the associations of wanting to drink or eat something later, instinctive associations, the emotions of seeing people, and all the emotional content associated with seeing faces of people. Oh, there's Anselmo, there's Krista. Yes, that's all these impulses and feelings and thoughts originate from one of these brains, each and every one of them. The implication being that we are not unified. All these different impulses, or eyes, as this teaching calls them, originate from these different brains in us all the time, one moment after another. Here they're divided into 3 and then 4. Finally, we divide them into 12. I will not go over the nature of these divisions because it is beside the point of today's workshop. We actually reviewed them in the past 2 months in quite great detail, actually. But we will only leave this point at the level that this teaching as many old teachings, say that our psychology is divided into 12 brains, or subdivisions of brains, here represented by the common deck of cards. And each of these is responsible for a set of such impulses or thoughts or emotions or perceptions. This was known in ancient teachings very well, very clearly presented here in this Gothic facade, where the 12 disciples of Jesus are divided into 4 groups of 3. Not unique at all, by the way, to this facade. Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper, for example, in Milan also has them grouped into 4 groups of 3. You see it again and again, especially in older Christian art, such as this 12th century facade. But long before Christianity, in Judaism, the kingdom of Israel was made of 12 tribes. The analogy of a country, a unity, divided into 12 individual tribes is very fitting, and one we will develop today. We have people attending today from many different countries. I assume, I can't say for certain because there are too many countries, but I assume most of your countries are divided into regions. Definitely those of you from the United States. I think Australia too, right, Tamara? I don't know so much about Australia. Many countries in Europe, Italy, France, England. So on the one hand, it's one country, it's one person. I am Asaf, you're Christian, you're Kelly, Aurel, we're all one. Just like the United States and Australia and Italy are one country. But then within that country, you have these separate regions. And especially in the older countries, these regions are very different from each other, aren't they? They actually have, if you go far back enough in time, they even have often distinctly different racial characteristics, sometimes even different accents. In many countries, even different languages. I'm thinking of Italy here again. Definitely different cuisines, different strengths, different weaknesses. And so the idea of drawing an analogy between the human being and a country, and between the lack of unity in the human being, as displayed here, and the diversity in a country made of 12 tribes is very fitting. And it already gives us a hint of what self-development might mean, because the moment you pool together 12 distinct tribes, you're going to have trouble. It's going to be very hard to govern them. Who gets allocated what resources and why? Why should we send money here or funds here? Why should we send water from the north to the south? And things like that. So you all have all these internal battles that a country would have. The same happens in the human being. Why should one part get something and the other part not? Or why should one part give something that belongs to it and share it with the other parts? So one approach, one angle, one more practical definition of self-development is developing internal government, the ability to govern ourselves, to balance and harmonize between the diversity that makes our being. This quotation from Ouspensky will lead us to another definition. Ouspensky says, we can learn to use the unused parts of our machine. This prison means really that we sit in the kitchen and basement of our house and cannot get out. And so Ouspensky points out something else. He says, yes, although we do have these many parts, we actually confine ourselves to the basest parts, the kitchen, the basement, the functional parts. When we actually have very interesting rooms full of furniture and painting and books and sofas and couches and flowers and stuff, but we don't go there. We stay in the kitchen in the basement. Some of these parts of centers are indeed more functional, definitely the instinctive center, which is responsible for the well-being, the maintenance of the body, feeding, eating, sleeping, health, staying away from danger, and so forth. And also the moving center is very functional, getting things done, moving things forward, navigating, and so forth. One way to understand Ouspensky's angle is that we very much spend time really in mechanical parts of centers. In the past weeks, the community has actually reviewed this, practiced this, observed this in action. And so another definition of self-development would be learning to access these other parts that are less functional and much more creative, perceptive, rich, really. But for that, of course, we need to first of all know them, learn them, and then learn how to access them by effort, by will. From one angle, there are 7 different levels of self-government. I restrict this, I say from one angle, because the lower levels are not really self-government, as we will presently see. But somewhere beginning with the 3rd level of the development of observing eye, we begin forming a body in us that can actually govern these different tribes, these different regions. And this improves and grows as we ascend the pyramid. To understand how that happens, we will go back to the tribes of Israel as recounted in the Old Testament, and to a specific moment where these tribes find themselves in Egypt. The person you see here being laid to rest is Joseph. This is the very end of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament. When Genesis ends, the second book, the book of Exodus, will begin. And this is just that turning point, this moment we show here in these illuminated manuscripts. There had been a famine in the land of Israel, and lacking food and water, the people of Israel had to migrate southward to Egypt. Joseph was first, and I skipped the circumstances of how that happened, again, for lack of time and relevance to today's presentation. But once he did make it to Egypt, he became very instrumental to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and in fact, his right-hand man. He counseled him, and so he received big privileges from him, so that later on, when his brothers came, they were welcome in this foreign land and thrived for a while. So we have our 12 tribes, symbolically speaking, but they're not in their motherland. They're in exile in Egypt. This is where the story begins. Joseph dies of old age. The Pharaoh also dies of old age, and a new generation replaces them. And the children of Israel, says the book of Exodus, were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty. And the land was filled with them. This is the land of Egypt. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, meaning all the favors and privileges that the old king had given Joseph are now in question. There's a new king. And moreover, Joseph is no longer around. He's died. And this new Pharaoh says to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. We have a problem here, or I predict the problem. They're growing, they're multiplying, and they're foreigners. They're not one of us. We have to do something about it. The Pharaoh decides to enslave them. So the next scene in this illuminated manuscript shows the commanding Pharaoh forcing them to do menial work, the work of builders, cleaners, and so forth. They become slaves in the land of Egypt. And now we have an interesting situation. Already, our condition was challenged by lack of unity. Remember, I told you a country made of 12 tribes is going to find it very hard to govern itself. It will actually need to establish government. But now, on top of that, those 12 tribes are slaves in a foreign land. So they've even less privileges. They're under more laws than they would anyway be if they were in their own land. In this teaching, in the fourth way, this state of slavery is called false personality. Our lower centers or brains are forced to serve something that is not true, that is not really me, not really you. But they're enslaved. They have no choice. Yes, they're bound. They do it on command. This forms the starting point, as you see on the pyramid. That's the very base from where we have to climb. It's not really, as I said, a level of government, because here we're in prison. But from here, the tribes will have to work their way up, elect the king eventually, or some kind of a leader that could lead them out of this very difficult situation, because nobody wants to be enslaved. Nobody wants to have to do the will of somebody else, somebody foreign to it, somebody who they haven't elected. To tie all of this to practicality, as so far I just covered the theory, although I covered it in story form, which is significant, because the fourth way, as we get it in the books, is written intellectually. It speaks to the intellectual center in the form of essays or questions and answers. Stories speak to essence, and especially when they're depicted with these very, what you'd call naive art, very sweet, naive faces, they speak to the child in us, which is actually quite important. It means it penetrates essence and not just our intellectual center, which more corresponds to personality. Still, so far I covered the theory. In order to connect theory to practice, I propose the following exercise to all the communities of the school in the past week. In preparation, I said, I invite you to choose a situation from your day that repeats regularly and make concentrated efforts to prolong self-remembering through it. I added even elaboration, and I said that it would be better if the situation would involve other people, dealing with your children, or your parents, or your brothers, or your friends, or your colleagues, or your boss, or your neighbor. People tend to evoke false personality in us more obviously, not exclusively, but more obviously than situations that don't do with people. And so I open this task, and through your responses, we will see how the myth, the story, becomes practical and personal. But because the responses are personal, Christian, this second part of the session we will keep private, and let's end the live broadcast. When I get the signal from you, Christian, we'll continue. Thank you for setting it up.